All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining us. We still got people coming in. Welcome to the latest installment of This Is CDR. My name is Chris Neidl. I am your host today, one of the co-founders of Open Air and currently the carbon removal lead for the UN Climate Champions. Those of you who are new to this program, we've been doing this well over 100 episodes at this point, mostly every Tuesday, occasionally with hiatuses like the one we just had. But the idea here is implied in the title, and we get right down to it. And we want to give people a very specific, exciting, current view of what carbon dioxide removal is. And we do that by talking to the leading exponents, innovators, and doers in this field, including the many heads of startups, of the many now hundreds of exciting carbon dioxide removal companies that we have around the world, different subject experts as well. Both on the science and the policy side. So very excited about today's episode with Will Kain from Avnos, and my buddy and co-host Tank will introduce him in just a few moments. But for those of you who are new to the program, just a quick update or quick overview on that. Open Air, been around for about 8 years. It's an all-volunteer network of people who are enthusiastic and passionate about carbon dioxide removal. And we involve ourselves in a number of different activities, from educational programs such as this, supporting enterprises in a variety of different ways, CDR enterprises, developing new business models. Some of you have seen previous episodes that have featured projects like the Naka Valley Biochar project in Uganda is an example of that. One of our real bread and butter, I would say, from the very beginning has been advocacy. Open Air and its members have been really some of the prime drivers, particularly of state and municipal level policy for carbon dioxide removal. And we've developed close to 15 bills at this point and passed about 7 laws. So have a lot of things going on currently in that as well. So if you're interested, plop on into our Discord. I don't know if plop is the right word, but jump right in is probably a more enticing verb to use. Tank will drop the link to that, and you can meet some other folks and be part of our community. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and bring up my partner and friend, Tank Chen. I'm going to bring up Will as well, and we can get right into today's program. Again, thanks, Will, for joining us. Really excited for this.
Thanks, Chris. Everyone. Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. My name is Tank Chen. I'm an Open Air volunteer based in Taiwan. Today, we're very excited to have Will Kain on the show. So Will is the founder and CEO of Avnos, bringing nearly a decade of leadership experience across early-stage clean tech companies. He previously launched Rushin Capital Management and served as VP Corporate Development at Nano H2O, a global desalination technology company. Will began his career at UBS Investment Bank and holds a BA in Economics and Government from the University of Virginia. So, Will, very nice to have you here. When you're ready, take it away.
Great, thanks, Tank. And Chris, thank you. Thanks to Open Air, the whole operation for having me and allowing me to talk a bit about Avnos. And of course, thank you to the audience for your time and attention. That's obviously very valuable. So thanks for spending some time here with me. So yeah, I'm here to tell you all more about Avnos, which is a direct air capture of carbon dioxide technology company. Obviously, that lives squarely inside of the CDR umbrella. And Tank did me a favor there, said almost a decade. I think I'm coming up on 2 decades now of time in the space, having started in this arena back in 2007 or so. So I've had a chance to see a little bit of everything in this climate technology space, and I can say very confidently that the momentum and the opportunity represented by CDR broadly is the most exciting that I have seen. So happy to have the chance to tell you all more about what we're doing at Avnos. And so without further ado, we can go ahead and jump through some slides here. So as an executive summary matter, we are commercializing at Avnos what we call hybrid direct air capture, or HDAC. And we use HDAC or the word hybrid to describe the differentiator that we offer to the market, which is that we capture both water and CO2 from the same airstream in the same system. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the system in a moment here, but a couple of things to highlight. I said it already, but we produce water. So as folks on this call are likely aware, the general relationship between CDR and certainly DAC and water is a consumptive one. And we've taken the approach of producing water in our system. So kind of an inversion, we like to say, of the traditional relationship between CDR and water. And what that water production allows us to do is we can take a moisture swing approach to CO2 adsorption and desorption. And many of you all will be familiar with moisture swing. There's been some research ongoing and publicized in moisture swing since the early part of this century. So we are standing on the shoulders of some really high value research that's been done in the past in moisture swing. I guess the joke is we're not the only ones crazy enough to try this. There are others in the space who are thinking about moisture swing, which allows us to eliminate any external thermal input to the system. And again, on this call, we'll know that external thermal inputs are the biggest single source of energy consumption, or the biggest single consuming part of the energy story in direct air capture. So two very unique technological differences there in production of water and the moisture swing approach to the CO2 mechanics. I like to talk about our team a bit. I wish I had more time to talk about the team, but it's world-class. We're up to 33 people now. And we've got extensive prior DAC experience on the team, which is super valuable, right? Where we're starting to have a broader perspective of the industry. And I think that's somewhat unique in the space. And we're going to talk about a couple here in a moment, but we got multiple project deployments. So we are on the pathway of rapid scaling and de-risking of the tech. So a few kind of interesting and exciting things about Avnos, and certainly a good summary of what's got us as a team excited about what we're after. So very briefly and simply, what is the HDAC process? So you can see a very, as I said, simple and brief graphic here on the slide. So the HDAC process is kind of two trains, and you can see those in train 1 and train 2 on the screen in front of you. And inside of each train, there's a water bed and a CO2 bed. And in this circumstance, air is diverted on the way in to train 1. So train 1 is the active side. First thing that we do is adsorb water vapor from the air, from the ambient air. Think of that as atmospheric water extraction or atmospheric water generation, just using the relative humidity in the air. So we've dehumidified the air in that water adsorb bed at the top of train 1. And then that dehumidified air travels out of the water adsorb bed and into our CO2 adsorb bed. Moisture swing CO2 adsorbent materials live. So train 1 is an adsorb and is saturating, is filling up with water vapor, the adsorb side, and CO2 on the CO2 side, water vapor on the water side and CO2 on the CO2 side. And as y'all are likely aware, the exhaust from train 1 is just drier CO2 lean air. At the same time, train 2 is 180 degrees off phase, if you like, from train 1. It's in desorb. So it's sealed off from the ambient air, and we're desorbing water vapor. And then we use that water vapor that travels from the water desorb bed and through the CO2 desorb bed. And that's where we produce our CO2, is leveraging that water. That's, as I said previously, it's a moisture swing on the CO2 side. So introducing that water vapor to the CO2 desorb bed allows us to get the CO2 out just using that moisture swing and not using an external thermal input. So as a product matter coming out of train 2, we have 4 to 5 tons of liquid distilled quality water and gaseous CO2 at 95+% purity, depending upon the given circumstances of an installation. So you get, as I said, 4 or 5 waters for every 1 CO2. And that water in being distilled is quite versatile and valuable, as many of you all will know. And then the last thing I'll say here is just when the adsorb side is saturated and the desorb side of the HDAC process is empty, then that seal switches and train 1 goes into desorb, while train 2 becomes the adsorb side. So each train can perform each operating state, and the trains go on switching back and forth between adsorb and desorb throughout their useful lifetime. So we think, a quite elegant solution to leveraging our unique approach in production of water and using that water then to bring about a moisture swing CO2 mechanic. So where are we doing this? Importantly, our first field deployed system is called Project Alpine. You can see the picture on the screen here. This is, as I said, it's the first time that we have demonstrated HDAC in the wild, so to speak. This is in Bakersfield, California. It was sponsored by the Department of Energy. We won the award to build this unit back in 2020, actually. It's been operational since September of 2023, which is that we're going to have its second birthday here in just a couple of months, which is hard to believe. But obviously something we're quite proud of is that we've been running this now for almost 2 years. And in that time, we've generated thousands upon thousands of hours of operating time and thousands upon thousands of cycles. And excitingly, it's performed as we anticipated, as we expected it to. We've seen great, robust performance in the materials that we use, and we have demonstrated that HDAC works in the field. We are adsorbing water vapor, then adsorbing CO2 using the moisture swing adsorbent from that dried out air, and then desorbing the water vapor and using that water vapor to desorb the CO2. So the unit operations are working. This is a super exciting one in our portfolio, not surprisingly. And, it's just great in general to have this as a development tool for us. We've got an asset in the field where we can test things that come out of come out of our laboratory, which we went a bit out of sequence in building out our technology development assets. That Project Alpine was actually the first thing that we started up. We got that going before the lab officially started, but the lab's been online since early 2024, so about 18 months now. It's in Bridgewater, New Jersey, so about 45 minutes or so from New York City. It's a state-of-the-art 18,000 square foot, technology development center. We have 15 employees there today, and we've got the end-to-end technology development process going on at the lab here in New Jersey. So as I said about Alpine, and certainly it's true of the Technology Development Center, a really valuable asset as we develop and deploy the technology. And we've created a positive feedback loop between the lab and Alpine, where we can take promising materials that come from the lab and test them at Alpine and generate real world data that then feeds back and helps to make things work better in the lab as well. So as I say, a nice positive feedback loop we've generated there. You see this mysterious blue pin that I've got on the slide here. Well, that is to represent that we are going to put Project Brighton, which some of you, if you were at the DAC Coalition conference in New York earlier this year, you heard me talk about Project Brighton, and we have talked publicly in other arenas about Project Brighton. So this is a rendering on the slide. It's going to go in that, it's going to go where that blue pin is. So right across the parking lot from the lab and from our technology development team in New Jersey. This will be 450 tons per year of CO2. And it's obviously, as I said, in Bridgewater. This is coming online this summer. It's under construction at the lab as we speak. This was sponsored by the Office of Naval Research, and we are working with the Navy to get to their primary interest appears to be in getting to fuels, to low carbon intensity fuels. And again, many of you here will recognize that as a producer of both water and CO2, we're a particularly interesting front end for processes. So that's the interest that with the Navy. And what's also exciting about this is we have commercial scale operating systems that are inside of that building there. So think of this as the unit of one. And as we go larger, we're replicating the systems that live inside of this unit. So we've kind of achieved the maximum scale of the technology, de-risking the technology at maximum scale by deploying this unit, which again, as I mentioned, will be operational this summer. So a super exciting opportunity for us to bring this to life, to have the facility in New Jersey, which will make, as I referenced previously, we can do full end-to-end technology development from the earliest phases all the way through to now a commercial deployment with Brighton, which makes this one of the leading R&D centers in the world for direct air capture, which again is something we're quite proud of. So that's kind of it for slides for what I prepared. Wanted to get everyone oriented around what we're doing at Avnos and how we're doing it. We've got some more exciting stuff that we're looking forward to telling all of you about over the course of the rest of this year. But this is this is the update. This is where we are and what we're hard at work on. So with that, I'll happily stop the slides and take questions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great, Will. I have a lot of questions, actually, some that popped up just watching this. And one thing I want to make sure I heard correctly, but before we get into that, and we do have some good questions from our buddy Sue Dorward, who Will has met, who's just a absolute CDR champion based in New Jersey. So we'll start bringing in some audience questions, but let's get started on this a little bit, as we always do. I mean, you have a very impressive pre-CDR life and in CV, but we always like to ask people, we always really like to emphasize that these are real people with visions and motivations and histories and plans. And I was wondering if you could just kind of flesh out a little bit more your journey into CDR and DAC specifically. What caused you to make the leap?
Sure. Yeah. It's I ask myself the same thing sometimes. What made me make the leap? But all in a good way. So as I mentioned, I've spent the last really since 2007. So I'm in 18 years into this early stage climate tech operations space. And I guess the thing that inspired me to get into this, I was working in finance. I started my career as an investment banker and started thinking about, how do we deliver economically relevant solutions sort of in that context to help solve major issues around the globe. And the one that I centered on was energy, right? in that 2007 type of a time frame. So certainly, I was interested in heading into a large commercial, for-profit space, and coming out of that history in corporate finance, I was thinking about economically rational solutions to deliver, on problem sets. And so energy was the one. And I've had a number of different experiences throughout that 18 years in the energy transition in climate tech. And one that I would highlight in particular, and Tank referenced it, was my time at Nano H2O, which was an advanced water treatment technology company. Started thinking a lot about water and water scarcity as a key vector in the manifestation of climate change that folks recognize is an issue. Water scarcity is an issue around the globe, but oftentimes that water scarcity doesn't get sort of brought into the conversation about climate tech related solutions. So anyway, I was thinking a lot about water. In 2016, 2017, after having exited Nano H2O, the Paris Accords hit everybody's radar, and that first IPCC report convinced me of the criticality of CDR. And within CDR, I was most attracted to DAC and the engineered nature of DAC solutions. And that made me totally convinced at that time that if we had any hope of getting to net zero, of really hitting our global decarbonization goals, CDR was mission critical, and within that, DAC was absolutely non-negotiable. And started looking out in the world at technologies in the DAC space, and came to this realization that the whole industry is working on. But how do we think about reducing the water consumption and the heat consumption profile of some other forms of DAC? Right. That more broadly, Chris and Tank, is how do we think about the resource intensity, resource efficiency of DAC? So set out thinking about and looking for ways to make DAC technologies more resource efficient. And I didn't necessarily think we were going to get to a place where we were producing water and eliminating the thermal input, but that's where we've got to, excitingly, with HDAC. So, I guess backing up to the front end to your question, thinking about DAC, given our emissions trajectories as a globe, it's just totally clear to me that removals have to be a meaningful part of our solution set to decarbonize. And so, wanted to go and attack that in a novel way. And we've been at Avnos very fortunate to attract a great team, great partners, great sources of financing to allow us to build up the resources I highlighted in the slides, and more, as I said, that will come over the course of the year.
Yeah, great. And Tank, at any point, if you want to jump in, you always have your own questions. We do have some stuff coming in from the audience, really good questions. But let me actually just stop on one thing you said. And I just threw a copy of the IPCC paper that you put in.
That's the one.
Which is the global warming of 1.5 C. And I think in the history of carbon removal, just the sociology of it, in a way, not just the science, that was maybe the most important moment because a lot of what you just described is so many of your peers in DAC space and CDR in general, that was a moment for them as well, whether they were academics or they had a private record in the private sector. They read that, and that was the first real clear articulation that we need to do CDR. It's not an option now. It's another thing we have to do. And we have to do a lot of it. And there was just almost overnight, hundreds, then thousands of people coming from many different fields. How do I get involved in CDR? And that created the DNA of the whole industry. It became this incredibly diverse thing where people were bringing in stuff they learned, whether it was from desalination or energy or whatever. And so I just want to kind of, always kind of point out the history of where we've all sort of come from, and what Will just sort of described as his catalytic moment is one that's shared by dozens, if not hundreds, of other people that lead or participate in companies like this. Let me stay on that for 1 second too, because as you know, Will, we're in a really interesting time for DAC. In some ways, there's great signals. There's many different companies now getting steel in the ground and showing the world what DAC is, which is that critical milestone, I think, to getting social acceptance. And then we also have some voices and frameworks, as we always have, that are trying to kind of call into question some of the sort of fundamental rationale or reason for doing DAC. And I just want to put forward a statement, and I'll just either leave it out there or you can add to it. But I think what a lot of people miss about DAC is they look at it in a very short term, what's it like now, expecting perfection right out of the gate. And the news is, or the message to deliver is that that's not how complicated technologies develop. They wend their way through many different phases. We called it the solar coaster when I was in solar. It goes up and goes down, and there's all sorts of uncertainty. And at best, you're walking around in the dark with a flashlight, and that's normal. And if we look at every single major technology that's meaningful for us today, there was all kinds of surprises, both good and bad, particularly during those early stages that set it on its current course. And I think when we think about DAC, we need to look at the long-term, first acknowledge, yes, we need to do lots of CDR. No, we can't do it all with nature-based solutions. And then you work back from there and you say, well, what do you want your CDR to be like? You want it to be able to do a lot in the future, and you want to know it happened, both at the removal and the storage side. Yeah. And that's why DAC, not because it's cool and has all this sizzle, it's because it scores very, very well in both the upside and measurability. But again, it has a long way to go. And most technologies that we just take for granted today, they labored away in obscurity, not with a major spotlight on them at every single phase from the earliest stages. So that's my quasi rant or clarification that I want to deliver. But Will, just wanted to give you an opportunity, if you had anything as a DAC guy, to kind of add to that.
No, I think you've got it exactly right, Chris. I would even broaden it to every technology. You said complicated technology. It's certainly true of that, but every technology, everything that we see around us today that we use in a tech, from a tech point of view, to execute on our daily lives, had a growth curve of some kind. And one of the things that we laugh a little bit about is that, in particular, in complicated technologies, chemical engineering and chemistry and process engineering and mechanical and all the things that go into DAC in particular, like, you should expect things to often get worse before they get better, right? Because you got to build this stuff, as you said, put steel in the ground and learn by doing, because there is no way just to get it right straight off the bat into any technology, much less, as I say, a complex chemical engineering heavy industry such as this. So we should expect there to be bumps, and to hold us as a DAC industry to account for the fact that delivery has not been perfect, when in reality, in that 2016, 17, 18 timeframe, there were 3 DAC companies, to be very frank about it.
Yeah.
And thank goodness for those 3 DAC companies, because they helped everybody on this phone call and everybody in this space learn a lot about a lot. But, that's like 8 years ago, there were 3 companies. So now here we are, where it's an incredibly exciting time in DAC. You're right, Chris. We are going into this, putting steel in the ground, deploying, scaling up, increasing capacity deployments, which is a critical part of any, again, industry growth curve. But 8 years ago, there were 3 companies. Right?
It's
so
extraordinary. Now,
it's remarkable.
North of 100.
Yeah.
It's hard to say. So there's some estimates of 180, and that's not going to stay that way, nor should it. But the fact, it just shows people, is this just some sort of smokescreen? It's like there's people's lives that are dedicated to this, that have started companies that are putting steel in the ground all over the world.
Absolutely.
So it's very, very real, even if it's very, very nascent still. One thing I have to ask you, I may have heard this incorrectly. So did you say that 5 units? I mean, the water thing is at the heart, obviously, of your technology, and it's so significant. And it's interesting to your background prior in water management. Did you say that, was it 5 units of water produced for unit of carbon removed, or was it the other way around?
5 tons of water per every 1 ton of CO2. Yeah.
That is extraordinary.
Yeah.
You're a water production company.
Volumetrically, I say it all the time. Volumetrically, we are a water company, but as and everybody on this call likely knows, revenue-wise, economically, we are a CO2 company, because the relative economic value ascribed to a marginal, unit of water versus a marginal unit of CO2 is heavily dislocated in favor of CO2. But yeah, volumetrically, we produce more water than CO2, which is largely a story of the relative concentration in the atmosphere, right? Is that there is vastly more water in every molecule of air than there is water vapor, obviously in the form of relative humidity, but then there is CO2. As everybody here is aware, right? That's one of our challenges in scaling and building big units, is we got to process a lot of air in order to access that CO2 at those dilute levels at 400 parts per million. But yes, volumetrically, you've got it. We produce more water than we do CO2.
Yeah, and I would say a big story would be just not using water at all. But the fact that you're positive on that, how does that, when you look at your sort of use cases in real worlding of this, does that affect your choices on site location, or do you integrate with other water infrastructure? What are the implications of being a water producer as well as a DAC company, and the other kind of role that you can potentially serve?
Yeah, by and large, it opens up the way that we have lived that experience is it opens up more opportunities to site our HDAC facilities. So we can go into water scarce environments, because we're not withdrawing water. Not only are we not withdrawing water, but we're producing water. Opens up more jurisdictions around the world where water is a scarce resource, and 50% of the global population lives a water scarce or water stressed existence here today in 2025, which is a pretty staggering number. And then to your other point, commercially, it does open up other opportunities for us where we can integrate with water infrastructure. Being distilled quality water, it's high purity and so highly versatile. It can be used in integrating into other industrial processes. We've already I mentioned, being as a front end into a fuels processing system, right, providing water and CO2, which are key feedstocks, 2 of the key feedstocks into fuels processing, for example. Things like, data centers are on everybody's mind.
Yeah.
Data centers are big users of water. So, an opportunity for synergistic integration with a data center or another industrial process. Doesn't have to be a data center that's a water user, right? That has water, cooling water in particular needs. And at that distilled quality, again, you can save on water treatment costs. Our customers in those integration circumstances can save on some additional water treatment costs, because our water coming from the air is distilled quality. So it really is, it's a significant differentiator in where and how we can locate systems, our systems as well.
Great. So I'm just going to ask 2 more questions and then hand it over to Tank to ask any questions he has, and then we'll pull in people's audience. One, Tank, though, I am going to absorb Janet's question in mine because I think it relates to another big sort of critical differentiator potentially. It's not the only DAC company that is able to make credible claims to this, but I think that the other part about using low grade heat is massively important for 2 reasons. Not only from an LCA perspective, where do you get that heat? What's the the carbon footprint of having to use very, very high temperature heat, but it's how you live out there in the world, because there's all kinds of industrial low grade heat that can be repurposed, and that affects their own scope 1 emissions of those types of facilities potentially. You just mentioned data centers, which are kind of in the last sort of honeymoon days of, I think, hiding, out of sort of compliance. Like that's a massive, emission source that's growing. And so I wonder if you could just quantify a little bit more how significantly lower the kind of heat that you can use in terms of your thermal requirements. And then to Janet's question, where are you sort of sourcing that? Are you looking at co-location with, directly with industrial facilities that can provide that? So just characterize that a little bit more for us, because I think it's really important.
Yeah. So if we zoom out a little bit, the short answer is we don't require any external thermal input, right? We consume, on a power basis, we consume electrons and only electrons as a baseline matter. To the extent that we leverage heat in the process, that is heat that we generate in the process. So we do have heat integration infrastructure where we can use heat that's generated inside of our system, keep it in the system to make use of that and drive down the overall electrical energy consumption of a system. So, but as I said, as a baseline matter, we do not require any external thermal input, which, to the point I was referencing a bit earlier, is a part of our resource efficiency story, is that we don't require heat. A lot of times, generating hundreds of degrees C can require burning something, and there's a carbon emission, a GHG emission profile associated with that. Or in electrical heating, in many circumstances, that's somewhat inefficient. So in any case, we're leveraging electrical only input, and any heat that we do use, we generate inside of our system. Now, having said that, right, you highlighted it, Chris, is heat's sort of a driving force, right? It's a source of energy. And so we are able to make use, because we don't require thermal input and we don't have a significant thermal swing inside of our system, actually able to make pretty good use of low-grade waste heat, right? So heat that comes from industrial processes, think of, sort of less than 50 degrees C type of temperature. Oftentimes that's in the form of water or steam, some type of heated water carrier. And we can make use of that because we don't require meaningful thermal ramp on a more efficient basis than some other approaches to CDR that do require a more significant thermal ramp. So that then, again, to the point of geographic location, we don't need to be co-located with an industrial process. That's not required. But to the extent that we have the opportunity for those co-locations, we actually have a pretty unique approach to making efficient use of that waste heat from those processes.
Great. Again, lots of good questions. My last one, which I think people probably share, I know at least one person who asked the first questions is New Jersey, New York City Metro.
Yeah.
Not the typical stomping grounds of a lot of DAC companies, both in terms of their headquarters, which are DAC companies, which are largely clustered in the United States and California, and then where they're looking to deploy are mostly in the usual places that, have large, geological storage reserves or, existing oil and gas background because of some of the shared infrastructure and expertise. And here you are 40 minutes away from New York City starting a plant, which I love as somebody from that area. So can you just tell us a little bit more about the story about why New Jersey?
Absolutely. New Jersey, the short version, I'll go into the longer version, is really access to talent. That was the big. We did a pretty comprehensive study looking at a number of locations around the United States. This is years ago now, to try to optimize for where to put that lab that's in Bridgewater. And at the end of the day, it was a pretty easy choice to put the lab in New Jersey. We've been very fortunate to have hired really high class, well qualified chemical engineers and technical professionals, many of whom were located in that area of New Jersey already, as some of the folks on the phone will be aware. Exxon's corporate strategic research facility has been located in, I think it's in Hunterdon County, New Jersey, for decades, which has spawned a bit of a cottage industry, if you like, of relevant skill sets. As you said, Chris, that oil and gas industry has a whole bunch of expertise and human resources that are valuable in our space. In addition, out in sort of eastern Pennsylvania, a bunch of the industrial gas companies have been operating out of that part of the country for a long time. In our area of New Jersey, there's a bunch of pharma as well, which is sort of adjacent, but has some of the chemical engineering, some of the research expertise that we're looking for. And then, New York is one of those metropolitan areas where, Chris, you'll know better than I, but what is it, like 40% of the population lives within a day's drive or something like that of New York, or 2 days drive. So I don't remember the exact stats, but at the end of the day, it was access to talent, both existing talent and thinking about pipelines, really high quality universities, and research going on in the area there. So that's the story of how we ended up in New Jersey. And then building the unit at the lab in New Jersey was a story of how do we, sort of make 1 + 1 = more than 2 in deploying a commercial unit at the lab that takes that feedback loop I described between Bakersfield and the lab in New Jersey and makes it much tighter and much faster. Right, that feedback loop, the velocity going from Bridgewater to Bakersfield is not quite as fast as it is going from the lab to the parking lot. So having that unit on site with the technical staff in New Jersey was when we got to that decision, was a bit of a no-brainer. It does not provide us the opportunity to sequester the CO2, for example. So we are still figuring out what to do with the CO2 that we capture at Brighton in New Jersey. But really, to access to talent is the baseline of how we ended up in New Jersey, and then making sure that we're leveraging that talent to deliver commercially relevant solutions is how we got to putting Brighton there.
Very cool. And that area too, Rutgers and in New York, the carbon utilization research, like there's just some real heavyweights in the history of that as well. How do you utilize carbon in a durable way?
Yeah.
So it's really interesting to have a DAC supply company setting up there. That's a whole other sort of forward ecosystem. And I do love what you said about, there's these histories of industries in certain places, oil and gas and farming. You're not talking about, being a part of it. You're just talking about being proximate to the generations of talent and institutions that are in that area that have skill sets that are relevant to what we're trying to do. So I think that's super, super smart and super cool. So I am going to shut up now, Tank. I promise you. So I'm going to hand over to you, my friend, if you have any questions. And then we do have some awesome ones coming in from the audience.
Great.
Yeah. Thank you. I really like that. The idea of not co-locating, but locating next to existing industries. A new way that I'm gonna keep thinking about. But yeah, I don't have any questions myself, but I think we could start with the audience question. Try to get through them as many as possible. So we'll start from the beginning, maybe. So this one about your capture system. Does it use a monolithic contactor? What is the structure like? The absorbent? Literally reading the question here, but yeah.
Very good questions. Ones we get a lot, ones we think about a lot, and with apologies, ones that we don't talk a whole lot about. We don't give a whole lot of detail publicly on these, but what I can say is that we do use contactors. We coat our adsorbent materials on substrates, onto contactors. So that is the way that we deploy both the water and the CO2, is by using substrates, using contactor substrates. These are not, sort of just packed beds, for example, of the materials that we use on each side. We can say we do leverage solid adsorbents for both water and the CO2. So this is not a liquid system. So in that respect, the solid adsorbents, that's what obviously a lot of the DAC industry looks like. A lot of the DAC industry uses solid sorbents. There are several liquid solvent companies, but the majority are solid adsorbents. So we're able to, as I said previously, leverage some of the learnings that have been published in literature and that we understand as an industry, broadly speaking, about solid adsorbents. That's probably the most I'll say about that.
We'll have a mix of technical questions here, which we always do, and then some other more general. But just for the benefit of our more lay audience here, do you want to just very, very quickly define what's a contactor and what's a solid sorbent?
Sure.
Helpful.
Sure. So I'll go in reverse order. So a solid adsorbent, it really is. It's in a solid phase. So they get our base material is a physical powder that's made up of very small. Think of them almost as a mental model of granules of salt or sand, right? It just in terms of appearance and feel. My technical colleagues would be angry at me if they heard me describing it that simply, but we'll make it that simple. So that is in solid form. You think of a grain of sand, for example. And then we take those base materials, those powders, and we coat them in a particular recipe. So we mix those solid phase adsorbents with other materials and create sort of a film, if you like, that we coat on what we call a contactor. So think of something like a catalytic converter in a car has a solid substrate, a contactor that the catalyst is coated onto before it goes into your car. That's sort of that's analogous to what we're talking about here. A contactor being a substrate onto which those adsorbent materials are deposited so that they've got a place to live and actually allows us to run multiple cycles more efficiently using that contactor deployment.
Cool. So adsorbent's the special sauce that absorbs and releases the carbon. The contactor's the thing that you need to engineer to put it on so you optimize for the amount of exposure that it has to the air. So,
you got it. Yep. Well done. That's right. Yeah.
Cool. We going right here in order, Tank, to Sue?
Yeah, I think so. So Sue, I think this is a good question. Sue, what is your ideal atmospheric humidity level? And I also want to, on top of that, ask so does that affect, the ideal deployment location? Yeah.
Another good question, one we get a lot, and one, Sue, I think we've talked about maybe previously. The good news for us is the way that we've engineered the system is we can tolerate a very wide range of atmospheric humidity levels. Folks on the phone will likely know that temperature has something to say about relative humidity. For example, everybody is broadly familiar with the concept of relative humidity. Well, the relative part actually speaks to the interplay between humidity levels and temperature. So when we think about our ideal atmospheric conditions, there are two levers there, both temperature and relative humidity. But suffice it to say, Sue, and Tank and Chris and everybody, that everywhere, think of it as everywhere that people live, we are able to operate our systems efficiently. So that we've got a very wide operating range in terms of the relative humidity. And then similarly with temperature, when you start to get into very negative C temperatures, every DAC system starts to have some type of challenges when things get really, really cold. Or I guess really, really hot as well. The extremes, as with any process, it's not just DAC, it's chemical processes, all rotating equipment-based processes start to see challenges when you get to more extreme levels, certainly of things like temperature. But again, broadly speaking, everywhere that people live, we can operate pretty efficiently on both the temperature and relative humidity basis.
Thank you. Okay, another question from Sue here is, how long does the adsorb cycle take? And the desorb cycle, so I guess, do you end up waiting for one another, or is it working simultaneously?
And Will, if you could just define that a tiny bit again for the in our audience.
You got it. Another good question, a good technical question. So The adsorb cycle is the process during which we remove things from the air. So in adsorb, we are capturing water vapor and CO2. And as I said over that diagram previously, think of like these adsorbent materials have a capacity. They're a bit like, a bucket or a cup or any sort of receptacle that you've got. They've got a capacity, and they're filling up with, on the water side, water vapor, and on the CO2 side, CO2 during the adsorb cycle. Then the desorb cycle is the opposite operating state. That's how we get the water vapor and the CO2 out of the system. So that's the difference between adsorb and desorb. And again, this is one where we don't disclose publicly what our specific cycle times are. But the last part of Sue's question, another very good one, is we have timed it up such that we are not waiting on one or the other. We're not waiting on the water and the CO2 don't have to wait for one another, and the adsorb and desorb don't have to wait for one another. We've engineered the system such that the cycle times are matched up quite well, so that we have, you've got kind of a batch process that looks continuous in that we're both adsorbing and desorbing at all times. So they are matched up. We are not waiting for one or the other.
Excellent. All right. This next one, Tank, as I just messaged you, I think maybe generalizing it, I'm not sure what Carbon Matrix LLC is. Thanks for joining, John. But more what you've described, Will, is that I can see lots of rooms for partnerships with other types of companies and industries. And maybe you could just describe a little bit about what kinds of partnerships, you do foresee in the near and long term. Sorry, Tank. I just wanted to reframe that a little bit, if that makes sense.
Excuse me, just 1 second. Sorry. A critical part of the conversation for DAC, for CDR, I think for climate tech, broadly speaking, is what are the partnerships, what are the collaborations that can be brought to bear to ultimately drive CDR, drive DAC up the deployment curve, up the maturity curve, and therefore down the risk and the cost curve. So at the end of the day, that's what all of this is a story of how do we get more steel in the ground, get more capacity deployed to de-risk and to reduce costs. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there in partnering, in building a network of collaborations to do all of those things, right? To mature the tech and to drive the costs out. So as a general matter, the biggest market for DAC CO2 is going to be subsurface. Right, that's where DAC is best thought of as a negative emission technology, and the best way to generate negative emissions is to sequester the CO2, whether it's in a Class 6 well here in the U.S., an EPA permitted Class 6 well that governs subsurface CO2 sequestration, or in mineralization type of technologies. That's probably that's where the biggest volume of CO2 captured from the atmosphere will ultimately go. So building out those kinds of partnerships has been important for us, thinking about how do we take our expertise in delivering technology and layer that against partner expertise in sequestering the CO2, again, whether that's mineralization or subsurface geology. We're also working on utilization partnership opportunities, as Chris, you pointed out. There's a different economic case to be made if we can provide our water and CO2 as feedstocks into commercially available materials. And so when we think about utilization, it's things like fuels, as I referenced previously, as we, as a water and CO2 provider, are a quite interesting and quite compelling front end for fuels. Other CO2 utilization approaches happen to have a water consumption profile associated with them. So in producing water and CO2, we make ourselves an interesting candidate for a number of those utilization opportunities. So I guess that's specific to commercial outlets for the water and the CO2 that we capture, right? Sequestration / mineralization or utilization. But broadening the lens, figuring out and working on partnerships where there are a whole bunch of parts of the puzzle here that need to come together, whether it's renewable power procurement on the front end, or offtake in a CDR credit space, right? There's all sorts of opportunity to collaborate further on those bases, but So I guess a number of different points where partnership and ecosystems and networks are really important to help us as an industry come along faster.
Absolutely. All right. We getting through these questions. I think we'll hit all of them. Very good ones from Ed. Go ahead, Tank.
Yeah, so there are quite a few here essentially asking an estimate for the operating costs or the capture costs of your technology.
And Will, sorry to editorialize further on
Yeah.
that. Going back to my original monologue after your presentation, I think it's always useful for people to not fixate too much on what the current cost is, whether it's per ton.
Yeah.
Certainly answer that question. But what do you think is a sort of a viable endpoint of where you're trying to get for that through scale? So I'll just add layer onto it.
No, I actually, that was part of how I was going to start my answer, is that the current operating costs are not something we talk much about, and for a lot of reasons, not least of which is I don't know that it's wildly productive, to your point, Chris, to start talking about where operating costs are today. Is they got to get lower, right? They're high today, and they got to get lower. And where we need to be focused on is how do we drive costs out of the system. And I think that's where a lot of folks, Chris, you referenced it at the front end of the call, is steel's going in the ground across the CDR space, across the DAC space, really for the purpose of scaling up and driving cost out. And, DOE has set $100 per ton target for DAC costs out in the future. And that's out at something like an nth plant, right, that all of us are shooting at. And, I think I see for us line of sight when you get to the nth plant, when you get to regular way manufacturing operations and mature supply chains and such, I see a line of sight. I see a pathway to $100 per ton or less for us. But I think in the near to intermediate term, some of the cost advantages that I reference in producing as opposed to consuming water and eliminating thermal inputs into the system, that resource efficiency that I've described oftentimes translates into cost efficiency. So, we're quite optimistic and excited about the near to intermediate term, looking like something less than $250 per ton at larger scale, tens to hundreds of thousands of tons per year, and getting on that cost out pathway to where we get down below $100 per ton. But work to be done, to be sure. But that's what we at Avnos and talking with others of our friends in the space, that's what everybody's focused on, is how do you drive cost out of the system.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Moving to this one, which again, I think we can simplify this dramatically. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. But I think there are two questions essentially here that are quite interesting. The first one is the sort of the opportunity in other geographies. How are you thinking about that? And then the second one is what we're going back to costs, is like, can you give us a breakdown of sort of, the overall cost, the sort of the areas, the cost areas, of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll go a little bit in reverse order. So the biggest area to drive cost out is in the capital expenditures required to build a facility. That's the biggest single cost of a ton of delivered CO2 from any DAC system. It's called the amortized cost of capital. So you got to spend a whole bunch of money up front to build one of these plants. And then as you amortize that cost, as you spread that cost over the tons of CO2 that are captured from that unit that's been built, that's the biggest single cost. It's that amortized cost of capital expenditure. So the biggest thing we can all do anywhere in the world, India, that was the specific question, or otherwise, is to drive the cost of that capital expenditure lower and lower, at the same time as boost the amount of CO2 that we can get out of a given unit of capital expenditure. So that's true of any DAC system anywhere in the world. I'm painting with a broad brush, but that's by and large, that's true of any DAC system anywhere in the world. Now, with specific respect to the climate in India, I can't speak detailed fashion here today, but what I would say is that the bigger considerations for geographic location today is where are the markets for the CO2 and or the co-products that come out of a given system. Now, obviously, we are in something of a state of unrest with respect to some monetization vehicles here in the U.S., but things like the 45Q, right? The 45Q tax credit makes the U.S. the premier monetization jurisdiction in the world for CO2 removed from the atmosphere. And it's considerations like those that are going to be the bigger driver of CO2 removal project locations than the specific climatic conditions. The climatic conditions will have something to say, and obviously that will true up to cost, is how much does it cost to bring about your solution in India versus Iceland versus Bakersfield versus New Jersey. But the biggest thing, the biggest open question, or to me, the biggest driver of where you put these projects is how are you monetizing the CO2 and, as I said, any co-products that come along with the capture or removal process.
And I'll just add to that, Ash and I lived in India for 3 years, married into an India family, very invested in that country and focused on this. And I will say, this is not exaggerating, I think India is a CDR superpower waiting to happen. It has almost everything you would want from a storage potential for ag-based CDR and the human capital of just the engineering resources that country has. And I do plan to do a This Is CDR, hopefully not too far off from a month, about specifically that opportunity for India. Hit me up on LinkedIn. Happy to talk to you more about India and CDR.
Cool.
All right. So, there are a couple more questions here around the electricity usage. I think you touched on this earlier, but yeah, if you can dig a little deeper into this.
Yeah. This is another critical question, another critical part of the cost buildup of a delivered ton of CO2. Well, I referenced the amortized cost of capital expenditures is the biggest single expense for a DAC facility. Next is energy. So an important question. And we will show less than 2,000 kilowatt CO2 at that facility in New Jersey, which I think will be the lowest deployed in the field that I'm aware of in direct air capture. So that's part of the resource efficiency story, and part of eliminating the thermal input and purely operating on an electric basis is then reducing overall energy consumption. And I guess thinking about the sources of power, the carbon math works best when we as a DAC industry are coupled with low cost renewables. So that's kind of the baseline assumption, is that as we build up capacity as an industry, is that we'll need to access renewables, which is a subject for a whole other episode here, is access to renewable electrons, which is something that all of us in the space are thinking about. There's obviously huge load growth in electricity, certainly in the US and broadly speaking in the world. So that's something that we've all got our eyes on, is how do you access low-cost renewables in a reliable fashion in order to, as I said, make the carbon math work as well as possible.
Absolutely. Well, we have come to the end here. I know there were a couple of other questions, but I think they were at least partially answered through Will's other responses. But I just want to say, Will, I'm very, very excited about your company. It's been great to get to know you on various panels and conferences over the last few years. And one thing I do want to end with, as I talk about what we have coming up, I'm also going to talk about something that Avnos is participating in. So just to pop up my screen here real quick. I think I got it right here. Great. Okay. So one of the things that we're really, really excited about with, I am losing, here we go, great, is we have a campaign that's starting under the Four Corners Carbon Coalition, which is an organization that's spun out of Open Air with Boulder County and Flagstaff, Arizona, focused on accelerating local government level leadership in carbon dioxide removal. And next week it launches, a week from today. And what this does is it's an initiative to get as many local governments all over the United States, which can either be the governments or groups of people that live in towns, counties, neighborhoods, to get into the exercise and the experience of purchasing carbon dioxide removal, which is absolutely essential, is not only creating the demand but getting people thinking at that level about CDR and making choices. And for this, we have a group of suppliers that were actually pre-selected as semifinalists by the US Department of Energy. So they've been vetted to an extraordinary level of rigor. And we'll be kicking that off next week. So this will be me explaining that, and then with the call to action and some instructions, wherever you may be, however it's the tiniest town in America or you're in a C40 city, come and join me for that. And we'll be kicking that off. And again, Avnos, we're very, very proud and happy to be one of the suppliers for that project. And then right after that, very, very excited. As I mentioned, I work for the UN Climate Champions right now. The big COP climate conference this year, it's going to be a really consequential one. I can tell you that, is in Brazil this year. And through the last several months of really looking at this, Brazil is one of those countries like India, the United States that I mentioned, that has so much potential to do carbon dioxide removal. And one of those solutions is just absolutely gobsmackingly enormous if you look at the academic literature, and that's enhanced rock weathering. So on the 10th, I'll be bringing in some of the market actors that are already active. In addition to that, we have a scientist who's joining, and we're just going to be talking about Brazil's enormous opportunity, not only to do ERW, but to level ERW up globally through its own. The conditions there, both technically, from a resource perspective, and even from a policy perspective, are really, really conducive. So please do join me for that. And with that, I will go ahead and say goodbye. Will, thank you again so much. And
thanks, Chris.
See you next week. See you, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Ending stream.